everyone, welcome back to my channel. So I am sitting in a slightly different spot in my room today. Figured I would switch it up. And I also want to mention that I got this lovely necklace and earrings. They match, so I'm very excited about that. But that is not the point of today's video. The point of today's video is to talk about classics. So I am not someone who particularly likes classics. I'm not a huge classics person, honestly, but I do think they have their place, and I'm glad that I studied some of them when I was in school and getting my English degree, because I do think it's important to have sort of a backdrop for your knowledge on English and literature in general. So that being said, I'm not a huge fan, but there are some classics that I think are definitely worth the read and things that I actually genuinely enjoyed or want to come back to beyond my college years. So that's what we're going to be doing today. And I also want to mention that this doesn't include children's classics. This is just adult classics. So if you guys are interested in a children's classic similar video, let me know in the comments, because I have quite a bit of experience with children's literature, considering that I'm a children's librarian. So I recommend children's literature a lot. So if that's something you're interested in seeing, let me know and I can make that video. But without further ado, let's get into the classics that I recommend. Alright, so for this list, I'm going to roughly go easiest reads to hardest reads in terms of the language. So I want to start off with a book that is topically a bit challenging, but writing-wise not particularly challenging. And this is a more recent classic, and you're going to find with a lot of these that they are more recent classics, though I do have a few thrown in there that are much older. But I think if you're going to start learning about classics and start reading classics, the newer ones are often easier because it's closer to the language that we know and understand now. So that aside, the first book is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. So honestly, I prefer The Bell Jar to Sylvia Plath's poetry, and that's a controversial opinion, I believe, but her poetry is honestly hard for me to decipher. I'll just come right out there and say that. So I've had positive experiences with poetry when I've been able to pick apart the lines and really figure out what's going on and understand it. And then I've had experiences where I really don't know what's going on in poetry. And with Sylvia Plath's poetry, I usually don't know what's going on. But The Bell Jar is a novel, and it's a lot easier to understand than her poetry. So this book is about a girl named Esther and her experiences at college. She's also struggling with some mental illness, so that's a huge part of this book. So it's accessible in that it is relatable to a lot of people, and it's also just written in an accessible fashion. There's not a lot of language that's hard to understand or figure out. So obviously the subject matter dealing with mental illness is challenging at times, but the actual experience of reading this classic is not too bad. And I think that if you're interested in Plath's work, I would come here first just because it is easier to understand than her poetry. And actually I found that going the opposite way and reading this first, then reading her poetry was a lot easier than reading her poetry and then reading this. And I've done both. So yeah, that is my first classic recommendation. I think this would be a great place to start, and it's also just a really fascinating character study. So highly recommend The Bell Jar. All right, moving along to a sort of bigger section that I have. I think that short stories are a great place to go for classics because a lot of classic authors have short stories, and a lot of short stories have been sort of given classic status because they're things that are taught in school all the time. Like, I have read so much Shirley Jackson in school just because her short stories are all over the place and they're really easy to teach because there's just so much to unpack in each story. So I think short stories are a really good place to start with classics, and I have a few recommendations for those. So the first one would be anything by Shirley Jackson, but primarily The Lottery, which is her most famous short story. And this is actually a graphic novelization of the short story. So obviously I would recommend reading the full short story first, but this is her grandson's graphic novelization of her short story. So it's got some really great art that really does feel like the style of the story. It definitely mimics the style of the writing really well. and I think it's beautifully done. And if you're looking for, again, a more accessible way to interact with classics, this is a great way to do that because you're getting the short story, the classic story, the lottery, but you're also getting art to go with it. You can just read the text and understand what's going on and get a lot from it, but I do really like the graphic novelization of it. So definitely Shirley Jackson short stories are a great place to go for classics. And another really well-known author for short stories is Flannery O'Connor. So I haven't read this entire collection, but the short story A Good Man is Hard to Find is one of the most famous Flannery O'Connor stories, and it's my favorite personally that I've read so far. And Flannery O'Connor is just a really, really interesting Gothic writer. So O'Connor was a very devout Christian, but she does play with the ideas of the negative aspects of Christianity a lot in her works, which I admire. Her short stories are a bit more challenging in terms of the writing than Shirley Jackson, but not to the point where you can't understand them. It just does take a little bit more effort to understand what's going on. So Flannery O'Connor's short stories are a great place to start with classics, and they're also just a great example of Southern Gothic literature. And then finally for short stories, we have The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So this is actually a bind-up of her novel Herland as well as The Yellow Wallpaper. I haven't read Herland yet, but The Yellow Wallpaper follows a woman who potentially is suffering from postpartum depression, and she is stuck in a room that is wallpapered with gross yellow wallpaper, and her husband is a doctor, and he's basically put her under a rest cure, which is supposed to make her better, but really just makes her go insane because she can't go outside, she can't write, she can't read, she can't do anything but rest and stare at this yellow wallpaper. So it is a hard read in terms of subject matter. Like, it's definitely intense, but it is pretty accessible. It's not really a hard read, and it's enthralling, which sometimes I feel like is difficult with classics. I'm often not enthralled by a classic, and it often feels like a slog or a chore. But with The Yellow Wallpaper, it's fast moving, and there's a lot going on and a lot to study, and it definitely kept me enthralled the entire time I was reading it. So I do really like The Yellow Wallpaper, and again, it's one of the more accessible classics, and I'm sure Herland is also great. I just haven't read it yet. But yeah, definitely check out Charlotte Perkins Gilman if you're into classic short stories, because I've had to read that story many times in college, so it's definitely one that's more well-known, but if you haven't read it, give it a read. Okay, moving into classic horror. This is a genre that I really enjoy. It's just really interesting to see the roots of the horror and thriller genres and kind of how they came to be. And I've talked about both of these recently, so I'll just make it brief. But The Haunting of Hill House is technically a classic. It's probably Shirley Jackson's most well-known novel. And this basically follows a couple of characters who go to a haunted house to kind of study scientifically, or try to study haunting as a phenomenon, and if it's really real, and how it happens. So it mostly follows Eleanor and Theodora, the two women who go to the house along with a doctor to study it. So it basically just follows those two characters and their experiences in the house, and it's very character driven and relationship driven instead of being super focused on the actual haunting. So yeah, it's pretty accessible. There's definitely an elevation to the language that you would expect from a classic, but it's not a hard read, and it's not even that scary. It's just a really, really interesting character study. So I definitely recommend The Haunting of Hill House, and I think it's a very easy classic and will kind of get you into the mode of classic horror without being really overwhelming or long or anything like that. And then, of course, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This is the 1818 text, so before it was edited and republished in the 1830s. This is the original text, and I don't need to explain to you what this one is about, but it is also relatively short, not very scary, and it is definitely a harder read than The Haunting of Hill House. But if you get a pen and you just annotate it a bit, honestly, it's not that bad. I've read much worse classics in terms of difficulty. So yeah, it's not the easiest classic ever. Mary Shelley's work had a huge influence on literature, but also Frankenstein became a huge pop culture phenomenon, and it's a huge part of our society, especially in the US. I see Frankenstein related stuff all the time, especially during October. So I think it's definitely worth the read for the cultural stuff, but also I think it was a very interesting read just in and of itself. Obviously, it's a classic, but yeah, I think this one is definitely worth the read, and it's really not that difficult to read. Just expect to put a little bit more work into reading it than you would an average novel, but it's not terrible. So, Frankenstein. All right, let's move into the category of more difficult and older classics. So this is the category that's going to take more work and more time and effort to read. But I still think they're worth it. So the first one is The Odyssey by Homer. So this is a very long poem. It's called an epic poem, which is just a very long poem that talks about some kind of journey or hero. And this book follows the character Odysseus as he goes on a myriad of adventures and encounters a lot of different beasts and crazy things. And the Iliad, which precedes the Odyssey, was also really interesting to me because I like war movies and war-related stuff. But it wasn't as gripping or interesting as the Odyssey, especially for someone who is beginning classics or is looking for more enthralling classics. I think this one is definitely the more captivating of the two because it does discuss like a journey and an adventure, and it's less about like war or any of those things. So there really isn't a dry moment in this book, whereas in the Iliad there definitely are some more dry war-related scenes. So yeah, this one is definitely a harder read, one of the harder classics I've read, just because the language is very, very old and very different than our current language. But I still think it's worth it. And if you don't want to read the full giant book, you can definitely always get an abridged version, or even like the children's classic version that's like really abridged. Either way, the story is fascinating, and I think you can still get a lot out of it with abridged versions. But if you want to just fully delve into the classic and read the full thing, I do think it's worth it. Though I will say that you might need some other resources in order to figure out this book. I will recommend SparkNotes to you because SparkNotes is a big help in just understanding the concept of a scene. And this is probably going to sound like I am cheating or was cheating on college stuff, but honestly, SparkNotes was helpful just in giving me an idea of the overall scene. So what I would do in a lot of these kind of harder classic situations is I would look up the chapter or look up the summary of the chapter on SparkNotes. I would read the summary, and then I wouldn't have to focus on the trajectory of the story. I could just focus on understanding the words. So when I was actually reading the book, I wasn't SparkNotesing it. I wasn't like using that for test purposes, but I was reading an overview of the chapter and then reading the book, so that way I had the concept of, okay, this is where the chapter is headed, and I know that, and I don't have to focus on not understanding the concept. I can just focus on really understanding the words. So that's my recommendation. Don't use SparkNotes to cheat on exams, but it is helpful if you are reading a classic and you just want a little bit of extra help in understanding what's going on. I also do recommend Crash Course, which is John and Hank Green's courses on lots of different subjects, but John Green does all of the literature stuff, and there's definitely crash courses on a lot of classics, and I find them really, really helpful, and just alongside your regular reading of the classic to just understand what the overall trajectory is. So those are my recommendations for extra resources with classics, but I do recommend the Odyssey if you want to take on something a bit more challenging. And then finally, we have Shakespeare. So I actually really enjoy Shakespeare, and not in a like I'm not like other girls kind of way. I genuinely enjoy Shakespeare, but it's not something that I read all the time for sure. It's very much a sporadic thing. And I know a lot of us have read Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet and Macbeth and all of those in school because that was usually required reading. But I actually think that the comedies are easier to read and more fun to read. So my two favorite Shakespeare plays currently are The Comedy of Errors and Much Ado About Nothing. So these are both comedy plays. This one focuses more on relationships and like marriages. And this one is just about twins and things being mixed up, etc. And they're both very, very short. Obviously, I don't have to tell you that Shakespeare is difficult to read. It's challenging to understand the words that are being used. It's very different language. And again, this is a situation where I would pull up SparkNotes and read the summary of a scene and then read the scene. And that tends to help a lot. Also, I really like annotating while I'm reading Shakespeare. These are my annotations from class. I annotated Much Ado About Nothing for class. But I think it is just helpful to annotate Shakespeare as you go, because then if you find a source that tells you what something means, you can just jot it down and then refer back to it, etc. I've actually seen The Comedy of Errors in play form, and it was incredible. I loved it. So yeah, I personally really like Shakespeare, and I think there is a lot to be gained from reading Shakespeare. But if you're trying to get into Shakespeare, I would recommend comedies, especially these two, because these are my favorite. But they're both really fun, and I finished both of them thinking, wow, this is really like enjoyable and silly, and it wasn't a taxing experience like I know a lot of Shakespeare study can be. So these are my last two recommendations for classics. Again, these are more challenging classics, but I still think they're definitely worth the read, and you can get quite a bit out of them if you have the right resources and the time to actually devote to studying them. So those are my recommendations for classics. If you are trying to get into classics or are looking for classics that are actually worth the read, those would be my recommendations. They're also some of my favorites, so I'm a little bit biased, but I think that they are all definitely worth the read and will contribute to your overall knowledge of culture and literature, etc. So that's my 2 cents. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.